Okay, on this episode of Collateral Banter, I have Duke Goldman, a baseball historian here on the show to talk to me about baseball, the history of baseball, and how it connects to America. You know, one of the themes on this show is authoritarianism, what we're experiencing today in America and all around the world. And I wanted to connect this back to history. You've written quite a few articles, been published on baseball. And so I'd love to hear from you. Give me a background of connecting baseball to the struggles in the 1930s about fascism in America and the Double V campaign.
Sure, sounds good. So baseball, like most of America in the 1930s, was segregated. Major League Baseball had African-American players briefly in the 1800s. By 1897 or so, right at the same time that Plessy versus Ferguson was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that separate but equal accommodations were okay by the Constitution, there was no longer even minor league baseball players who were African-American, and African-Americans had to find their own teams and eventually their own leagues. In the 1930s, there was the beginning of a slow effort towards changing that. At the same time that we were in a period of rising fascism and nationalism. Sound familiar?
A little bit.
In the 1930s, as they developed, as there was a movement towards war, there was crusades going on in African-American newspapers. One of those newspapers, one of the two preeminent newspapers in America at the time that covered black issues that were circulated amongst black America, was the Pittsburgh Courier. And the Pittsburgh Courier had a sports writer by the name of Wendell Smith. Wendell Smith became a member of the sports writing wing of the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Later on, he was the guy who roomed with Jackie Robinson when Jackie Robinson first debuted with the Brooklyn Dodgers. But he, in the 30s, started to put pressure on Major League Baseball to integrate. Not to say that Major League Baseball was listening. You know, Black America read their newspapers, and this really did not circulate to any great degree amongst white America. But Wendell Smith and also the communist press, the Daily Worker, was very invested in this campaign, a campaign to integrate baseball. Wendell Smith went and interviewed 8 different major league managers, I believe it was 1938, and 5 of them said they were totally okay with there being black players in Major League Baseball. And he also spoke to a number of players, and he got mixed reactions, but there was quite a degree of receptivity, but nothing was happening. Well, as this developed, black ball players were playing in the Negro Leagues. We, of course, had a signal event in America when we were dragged, maybe kicking and screaming, you might say, into World War II when Pearl Harbor was attacked, December 7th, 1941. And the Pittsburgh Courier received a letter January 31st, 1942. Less than 2 months after Pearl Harbor. The letter was from a regular citizen, a cafeteria worker from Kansas named James Thompson. And James Thompson said that he felt that there was a dilemma that people in black America were facing. Black Americans, like white Americans, were confronted with a war against the forces of evil which threaten our existence. But he asked in this letter of himself and other black Americans, what should we be doing? We live as half Americans. We are not treated as equal partners in this society. Should we be committed to this conflict? And his answer to that, his way of saying, well, how could we deal with the idea that we're fighting the forces of fascism at home when we have racism abroad, when we have racism at home? His answer was, we have to fight for a double victory. A victory against the enemies from without, across the seas, as well as the enemies within, the racists in America that were perpetuating white supremacy. And so this concept of a double victory became a crusade in black America because the Pittsburgh Courier marketed it. 1 week later, the black newspapers printed generally once a week, and the Courier printed once a week. The next week, they had designed a logo of 2 V's that they put on the top of the masthead, and they declared this campaign. We were now going to fight for a double victory, a victory that was now going to include black America. And it became a movement, America.
It went viral.
It went viral, right. The version 70-plus years ago of viral. What happened was within weeks, there were hundreds of double victory clubs. Something like 200,000 African Americans join these clubs in the next few months. The Courier published 970 different pieces over the next 6 months that referenced the Double V campaign. They had letters to the editor, they had editorials, they had people referencing it. They printed a Double V Girl of the Week. At what they were doing at the time, sexism was rampant.
I had a question for you. In hearing that, I was curious to know, did they ever talk about how they would fight fascism at home? When you think about it, World War II, they're going to fight fascism abroad, and it's a military campaign. Did they ever specifically address how they would
I think it was about organizing. It was about community. It was about crusading. It was about parading. They had rallies. They had a famous rally in Harlem. They displayed their emotions and their feelings. So a lot of these crusades were not necessarily we have specific answers, although some of the answers were also putting pressure, for instance, on the Roosevelt administration to have a commission that looked at employment practices, the Federal Employment Practices Commission, FEPC. So there were people involved in looking for more formal means. This was not a formal mean. This was more of a sort of an emotional outburst. We're going to declare that we need to have an end to racism in America if we're going to participate full throttle in this war to end injustice abroad.
Wow. So it was a civil society struggle against fascism at home and fighting a war abroad to make America secure. And why do you think, as one who reads about history, that more isn't mentioned about this Double V campaign?
Now, I will tell you that in African American histories, books that are devoted to the civil rights struggle, Double V will get mentions. First of all, it was primarily in the African American community, primarily in African American newspapers. Although I will tell you that much more Republicans than Democrats, but people like Wendell Willkie, the 1940 Republican nominee for president, and Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York, and then the 1944 and 1948 nominee, both of them advocated for the Double V campaign. Some actors like Humphrey Bogart, he spoke out in favor of it. But it was much more in the African-American community. So part of it was, yes, it did not get this level of awareness in white America. Another reason that it did not penetrate the consciousness as much was that the Courier did not run this campaign very actively after the first 6 months. They made an editorial choice to start featuring more positive affirmations of African-American heroes who were in the military, who were making a difference in the fight against fascism abroad. So they kind of slowed it down, and the mentions started to peter off in the second half of 1942. Now, they did have what they had done between stories in their newspaper, starting shortly after the campaign. Instead of having a straight line, they would put a line with 2 dashes in between each story, and that represented Double V. That line appeared between every story from 1942 until just after the declaration of surrender of the Japanese. So implicitly, this campaign was going on. There were places in other media where it was mentioned. Now, by the way, other newspapers picked up on the campaign. They didn't always call it Double Victory because they did not want to, they were fighting for, a circulation, and they didn't want to, endorse the Pittsburgh Courier. But you'd see that the Chicago Defender, which was the other major newspaper, the LA Sentinel, they would have mentions of there being a campaign, a crusade for victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, euphemistically titling it something else that everybody in Black America knew talked about Double V. So there was a continuing awareness in Black America, but it was not an open major crusade after those first 6 months.
Okay, wow. No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Can you talk a little bit about Jackie Robinson? And I know you're working on a book about another player who's going to integrate the league by the name of Monty Irvin. Yeah, talk a little bit about Monty Irvin and the Jackie Robinson and that connection to the war.
Well, as everybody knows, who knows anything about baseball and or civil rights, Jackie Robinson was the man who, as I like to put it, reintegrated baseball. He wasn't the first African-American, but the first in the 20th century. He was signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers in late 1945. Actually, the signing was declared in October, but he had been signed in August of 1945. Jackie Robinson had been in the military in World War II, as had Monty Irvin. Jackie and Monty had similar stories. They were born 3 weeks apart in 1919. Jackie was born in Georgia, and his family, part of the Black migration, moved out to California. Monty Irvin was born in Alabama, and his family, as part of the Black migration, when Monty was about 8 or 9 years old in the late 20s, moved up to New Jersey. Both Jackie and Monty were schoolboy athletes, and they were multi-sport athletes, and they were phenomenal, both of them. Both of them did track, both of them played football, and both of them played baseball. Jackie was not actually principally a baseball player. Monty was. For Jackie, baseball is probably his third or fourth best sport. But both of them ended up in the military during World War II. Jackie became a lieutenant. He was, in part because of pressure put forth by Joe Louis, the boxer. Jackie got to go to officers training school, became a lieutenant, but was on the military bases. And in 1944, Jackie was on a bus down near Fort Hood, Texas. At that point, even though the military was not integrated on the bases, had been a rule promulgated that there was integration. And so when Jackie was on a bus traveling on a military base, a bus driver told him he needed to move away and not sit next to a woman he thought was white, who turned out actually not to be. Jackie made issues with it, and they ended up having military officials came to the bus. The bus driver refused to drive, and Jackie was arrested for insubordination and court-martialed. And Jackie was acquitted, although there is certainly an argument that based on the rules of the military, Jackie could have been convicted. But he was already a star athlete, well known in America for his track exploits and his football exploits, played for UCLA. And the military did not want that kind of bad publicity. Right. So he was acquitted, and then he was honorably discharged. This meant Jackie was at loose ends in 1944 and eventually decided there weren't a lot of opportunities for an athlete post-college. He actually didn't finish college, but he had no interest in going back. And he saw the one pathway to professional sports was to play in the Negro Leagues. He got recruited to play for the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro American League in 1945. So Jackie played half a season in the Negro Leagues. Meanwhile, Monty Irvin had gone to the Negro Leagues much earlier. He started in 1938 when he was still in school. He was starring in the Negro Leagues in the early 1940s. Monty Irvin ended up first going to Mexico in 1942 for a year, and then from there he came back to the States and in early 43 was inducted into the Army. He trained through 1943. During that time, he ended up being sent to Europe. So he was in the military theater of operations in Europe, and he suffered. Jackie, discharged, plays in the Negro Leagues in 1945, and it is at that point that Branch Rickey, who was the owner of the part owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, was looking for black ball players to integrate baseball. Right. Monty was still in Europe, and when he came home, Monty had some inner ear problems. He was experiencing what today we probably would call post-traumatic stress disorder, and he was on a military hospital. He came home around September, and he was not available and ready for the Leagues. He had started in the Negro Leagues, and there was some indication that the Negro League owners in the early 1940s thought that if and when integration came, Monty would be the best candidate. Jackie had only played half a season in the Negro Leagues. He was not nearly as well known as a baseball player. Jackie was available and ready. Monty was not. Jackie got picked for the major leagues, and Monty went back to the Negro Leagues.
Wow, because of the war, essentially.
Essentially because of the war.
Right? I mean, right. And their different paths
Correct.
That they went.
So accidents of history,
more people would know about Monty.
Absolutely, right.
If he had been the first, yeah.
If he had been the first. And Monty always has said, and I am in the process of still researching this. It's hard to, in doing history research, getting to the absolute story of what happened is often a very long and arduous process. Monty always said in interviews, including when I interviewed him, that when he came back in September of 1945 from World War II from Europe, that Branch Rickey and some of his lieutenants had approached him to sign with the Dodgers then, and he told them, "I'm not ready."
Oh, wow.
Now, if he had signed then, he wouldn't have been before Jackie, but it's possible he might have debuted with Jackie.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It wasn't originally the intent. This is not well known. It was not the original intent of Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers to pick one ball player to integrate. They thought it might be better to have a few or a couple, two or a few.
Okay.
But as it turned out, Jackie was the first. He was the one who was most ready. He went to the top minor leagues in 1946. Monty went back to the Negro Leagues. Jackie started in the beginning of 1947. Monty didn't end up going to the major leagues until 1949, 2 years later.
I have a question in hearing this, players and connecting to the war, but can you talk a little bit about baseball's role in American culture? And I wanted to bring that up, and maybe that's kind of broadening the perspective from this, but more broadly speaking, so you see these two players integrating the baseball. What did that mean to American culture at that time?
Sure.
Was it, if there's one sport in my mind that is all American, it would be baseball. Even though football today might have an argument that it makes more money than baseball, that it is today what baseball was, but there's been a cultural power that baseball has on the American
Sure.
culture.
Well, first of all, although baseball did not originate in the United States, Abner Doubleday, who was purportedly the inventor of baseball, had absolutely nothing to do with baseball whatsoever. Baseball originated in England and was brought over here. But baseball was played in America back in the 1700s, before the American Revolution. Long before most people realize it. So baseball was an American sport. It became an American sport. And it became incredibly popular in the 1800s, in the second half, when team sports were only beginning. So you did not have, basketball, for instance, wasn't even invented until 1891.
Right.
Football was beginning to evolve in the late 1800s, but it was nowhere near what the sport is today. It was a very rough, more rugby-like version of the game. They didn't have forward passing at that point. It was kind of like a scrum, and it was played in colleges. There was no professional leagues. So baseball started before these other major team sports, and it became the American sport. So when you got into the 1900s, baseball was the most popular game in America. And by far, and before football and basketball took off, after baseball as a sport, the other two most popular sports in America were generally acknowledged was boxing and horse racing. But baseball was number one. Baseball was played everywhere. It wasn't just that it was the national game that people watched. You know, quite honestly, the major leagues was located in the northeast quadrant of America, and not that many people got to see it, and there was no television, and not until the 1920s was there radio, but people were playing it all over the country on all sorts of levels. Before there was Little League, there were town teams, there were industrial teams, there was all sorts of versions. It was played in sandlots, it was played as pickup games. People played baseball. It was the American sport, okay? And that meant that it had a resonance in American culture. And there were things that happened in baseball that had an impact on race relations, that had an impact on labor relations, had an impact on antitrust laws. Major League Baseball had an exemption from the antitrust laws since the 1920s by a Supreme Court decision. So baseball had a unique place in the American parlance, if you will. And the other sports
Caught up, certainly.
have caught up. Today, it doesn't have that, but baseball's involvement with American history. Baseball is a lens through which one can view significant aspects of American history. I don't think you can really make the same argument for football and basketball.
No, yeah, definitely. Can you just mention how difficult was that process for baseball in integrating Black players into the league?
It happened, as I like to quote the line that was used in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, when separate but equal was struck down, and integration was supposed to proceed, as the line went in the decision, with all deliberate speed, which sounds like a contradiction. Well, Major League Baseball, just like there were people who dug their heels in Mississippi and Alabama and did everything they could to stop integration, you had owners in Major League Baseball who were foursquare against this idea of integrating and took their sweet time. There was famously a discussion of the 16 major league owners after Branch Rickey had decided and had signed Jackie and was going to integrate. They had a meeting and they had a vote, and the vote against integration was 15-1, the one of dissenter being, of course, the Dodgers, who were going to integrate. The rest of the teams just said, we don't want this to happen. And actually, after a document had been written up for reasons why this wasn't a good idea, but Larry McPhail, who was then an owner of the New York Yankees and previously had been involved with the Brooklyn Dodgers prior to Branch Rickey's time, he insisted that nobody should get copies of these documents. They were held closely because there was some awareness that if it got out, they would all now, things were starting to change. Things started to change in America because World War II really did have an impact. Not that there wasn't still large avenues of racism all over America, but there was more, especially in the Northeast, a sense of, wait a minute, what's going on in this country? There's a dawning awareness. People are literally sacrificing their lives for the American cause. How can they fight on the fields of France, but not be allowed to play on the fields of baseball, our American pastime?
Or vote matter in certain parts of the United States.
Right, and that persisted.
Persisted well 20
beyond.
Years later.
So the owners, famously here up in New England, we can talk about how the Red Sox owners did not integrate.
They were the last team? They were the last team.
They were the last team to integrate.
If I could just add a quick note here. They recently changed at Fenway Park. They are now calling it Jersey Street.
The street was called Yawkey Way, and correct. Is now called Jersey Street.
I would have preferred if they had just honored the first black player for the Red Sox. That, to me, that just makes sense to honor it instead of removing Yawkey Way and bringing it back to its original name. But I digress.
The thing I would comment about that is that in reverting to the name Jersey Street, there is some, I don't think it's resolved, but there is some evidence that Jersey Street was named after somebody that had been a slave trader. I don't know if that's the right answer. That's a controversy and a discussion for another day. So the Red Sox also famously tried Jackie Robinson out in 1945. In early 1945, because of political pressure. They tried out Jackie along with two other players, one named Sam Jethro, who, by the way, integrated the Boston Braves, because there were two Boston teams at that time. Sam Jethro, in 1950, played for the Boston Braves. So there was a Boston team that had an African-American major leaguer long before the Red Sox, and another guy named Marvin Williams. The three of them tried out with the Red Sox in 45. It was a sham tryout. It never went anywhere.
That this has hurt the Red Sox, this type of history, especially with players being called names, start warm-ups and things like that, and it's sort of built into this reputation. And look, I've lived in Boston. From what you're telling me about baseball, has actually hurt itself, like not attracting players to come with skills and talents who could have made the team stronger and better. Now, I am not saying that that is an indictment on all Boston sports or things like that, but I constantly read in news articles players not willing to sit down with the Celtics or the Red Sox and not wanting to play here, and just saying, no, I won't go.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Boston has a reputation as a racist city amongst many African Americans, and particularly athletes. For years after integration, Boston still had its struggles. And then they had players like Reggie Smith, who played with the Red Sox in the 60s and 70s, who were not terribly happy and ended up getting traded away, partly because they wanted to, because they were not happy being in Boston. Bill Russell battled the Boston media for years. The Celtics, to this day, they won 8 straight championships and 11 out of 13, and yet through all those years, the Celtics did not sell out. The Boston Bruins were more popular, even though they were not winning championships. Yeah. And somebody broke into Bill Russell's house and defecated on his bed.
Wow.
And that's been documented as having occurred, and he was unpopular for his activism.
I mean, a lot of athletes have, Muhammad Ali and many others. Yeah. Okay, coming back though to baseball, I also want to just bring in a little bit as we begin to wind down here, a little bit more about baseball today. I wanted to get your view of what do you think is happening both culturally with baseball in terms of ratings drop. Last year, I remember reading several articles about people not showing up to stadiums and to games. Could this be unraveling for baseball? There's also discussions about the number of home runs that have been happening recently that are far above the averages for the last 10, 20 years or so. I'm sure you know a lot more than I do about this, but what is going on today or in the last couple years culturally with baseball, and what do you think the implications of that are?
Baseball is less relevant, especially to younger people, to the millennials, Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z, as some people put it. Baseball is seen as an antiquated sport and a slow sport. It is not culturally hip. This is a problem. It has lost action on the field. It was already a slow sport. It has become even slower. The games last longer. As you referenced, there are not only more home runs, there are more strikeouts and walks, which means that less and less the ball is put in play. There is less activity on the bases, less steals, less hit and runs and bunts, and sort of fast-paced play. The Negro Leagues, by the way, was famous for that kind of play, a razzle-dazzle, entertaining kind of action. And that action is sadly missing in today's game, which has slowed down. The owners are not very good at marketing the sport. They do not promote their athletes sufficiently, such that a guy like Mike Trout plays for the California Angels. Center fielder is one of the all-time greats playing today. And perhaps the argument is he doesn't have a colorful personality, but baseball has not done enough to promote him. Part of the reason I believe is that the owners are making money right now, and they're less concerned about the future of the sport. They see it as something that they can make plenty of money on because their internet properties are successful. The streaming and the merchandise, baseball merchandise, is still very popular, but attendance is down.
Wow. It just makes me think that the owners aren't interested, but they will be if the current projections continue and the numbers begin to drop, especially in comparison to other sports. And I mean, it's interesting to see this cycle of baseball being so dominant, like you were talking.
It changed in the late 50s and into the 60s and 70s. That's when baseball stopped. But persistently, well into the 20th century, baseball was still, if not as popular as football, close. Now it is nowhere near as close. But baseball is having its challenges right now. And one other point just to mention is baseball also has very low percentages of African-American athletes, much less than there had been.
Really? A smaller percentage? Now talk about that a little bit.
Yes, the game has now become much more international, which is not a bad thing. There are because baseball is still a much more popular sport in many Latino countries as it is here. And so there are players from the Dominican Republic, from Mexico, from Venezuela, a few from Colombia, from Puerto Rico, which is a part of America, although, you kind of wonder when you see what our president does to Puerto Rico.
Right.
But, it's a Latino enclave, and there are a lot of players from there as well. And so there has been a consistent uptick to where I think close to 20 or more % of major league players are now Latin American, and even higher percentages of the minor leagues are Latin American, whereas African Americans now represent less than 10% of major leaguers. And their peak had been sometime around 1975. I think it was about 27% were African American. So there's been a consistent drop.
And that drop probably connected to its shrinking popularity with
Mix of things.
Other sports coming in.
Baseball, an easier sport to play when there's a lot of space, and African Americans, as they over the years moved more and more to the cities, and even in the cities, a lot of fields had football stadiums. Baseball is also expensive for kids to play. Now baseball has become a travel team type of sport, so people have to pay for their kids to be able to travel. Baseball has a little more equipment, certainly compared to basketball, where all you need is a hoop and a basket. And a basketball. In baseball, in baseball you need gloves and bats and balls and uniforms. It for a multiplicity of reasons. It's not only that the black athlete is not participating in the sport, African American fans are scarce. When you go to a major league game, or a minor league game for that matter, you see very low percentages of African Americans.
And do you know if in the past that was also were there more African Americans?
Of course, one would not be surprised, in the years after African Americans broke into Major League Baseball, African American attendance went through the roof because, first of all, at that point, Negro League Baseball had been very popular in the African American population, right? Again, here we're going back to the 1930s and 40s, and the other sports have not taken off yet. Professional football, professional basketball was in the NBA, for instance, didn't even exist yet. Professional football did exist. It wasn't nearly as popular. You did not have African American athletes. Professional football did have African Americans from 1920 until the mid-30s, but then they had a period of segregation again. So baseball was preeminent in the African American culture, and then when Jackie Robinson was signed and when African American players gradually started to appear on major league teams, the fans flocked. Okay, but that declined over the years.
Okay, as we wrap up here, let me ask you, but baseball, what do you predict will happen in maybe 5 or 10 years? Like where baseball is headed?
They are beginning to make changes in the rules. What they're really doing is trying out all sorts of radical ideas in the Atlantic League, which is not affiliated Major League Baseball. It's an independent league, which they've made arrangement with. So they're trying all sorts of things that they're considering, some of which I think are meaningful and some of which I think are radical and ridiculous, all with the idea of speeding up the game, bringing more action to the game. I think they realize one of the biggest problems, in my view, and I've talked with many other baseball historians and fans about this, they need to do something about how many pitchers are brought into the game. The game slows down to a crawl when they are constantly bringing lefties and righties and lefties and righties into the game. The other night when I was watching, I think it was the Red Sox game, and they had 7 pitchers in a 9-inning game, which is now pretty common. And when you have 7 pitchers, usually what it means is after the starter has been in for 5 or 6 innings, now they have every half inning, there's another new pitcher, and they're bringing in sometimes 2 or 3 pitchers within an inning, and that means breaks and constant breaks in the flow of the game. So they're now proposing, I think they're going to implement next year, a rule that relief pitchers have to pitch to either 3 batters minimum or to the end of an inning. And they're also apparently going to limit how many pitchers can be on a pitching staff because left to their own devices, major league teams would have as many pitchers as they possibly could have. And the more pitchers you have on your bench, the more you're going to use. So that's one area that they're looking at.
Right. And usually, and I've seen this all the time in baseball, they would put in 1 pitcher for just 1 hitter, just to take care of 1 guy. They'll put in a lefty against a lefty.
The orthodox belief is that a left-handed batter does less well against a left-handed pitcher and a right-handed batter against a right-handed pitcher. They're always looking for that, what they call platoon advantage in the pitching. So sometimes it means 3 or 4 guys pitch in a given inning, and that slows the game to a crawl.
Because they need to come onto the mound and...
Well, yeah, they have to get warmed up, and then there's a commercial break. You know, it can turn an inning from a 10-minute thing to a 25-minute thing. When I was a kid watching baseball in the 70s, most games were over within 2.5 hours. Now, a fast game is less than 3 hours, and it's just gotten too slow.
Culturally, though, and this is my last question here for you, what does baseball mean to American culture today? Like, what do you think it means now?
I think it is seen as a throwback to old-time America. I do think that there is still a fan base. Naturally, it is a fan base that tends to skew older, but I teach baseball, and I meet youngsters who are still involved in it. A lot of them are much more into the statistics, the analytics. That's really what is taking off today. Baseball still has an advantage to other sports in that it is uniquely designed to study the contributions of individual athletes. It can be analyzed statistically better than any other sport. So some of the people who get caught up in it today are caught up in that analysis. And that is still appealing to some people. Culturally, in terms of, it's still played in Little League. It has, some presence, but it is not in any way as culturally ubiquitous as it once was.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Duke Goldman. Thank you for coming on Collateral Banter. Appreciate it. Take care. Have a good day.